Thank you so much, and thank you for having me, everybody. I'm just going to start my presentation. Okay. Whoops, here we go. Right. So, coming from the Bay Area in San Francisco, whoops, we're going to go back to the start. Hang on a second. Now you're going to see it all. Here you go, real quick. All right. Um, Coming from the Bay Area, you've seen and may have heard a lot about what's happening from a jobs and housing perspective in the Bay Area. We were at a crisis point. We were at a crisis point for many years where it was totally unaffordable and very difficult to find a place to live and find a lease to rent for office space. We have a lot of history in the Bay Area of conflicting values. We have questions of whether or not people want to see more growth in the Bay Area, whether they want to see more sustainable development in the Bay Area. The term NIMBY, not in my backyard, was very rampant, and has actually delayed a lot of these opportunities for affordable housing, for inclusive development, all these different things on the back of being a region that really celebrates climate action and sustainability and all of the different catchphrases, if you will. But the reality is that the COVID pandemic really pressed a nerve and shone a light on the fact that we hadn't been doing our homework, we hadn't been doing the work that we need to do. And because there are cultural differences that may not ever be reconciled, and downtowns and central business districts and the urban cores is really that commingling where all of those tensions, opportunities, values, and fears all coexist. And there is no simple solution. This will not be a presentation of how easily we can change things. It's more of a situation of a cautionary tale of what happens when you don't really understand the dynamics that are happening in a region and how quickly they can happen. When I was the chief innovation officer there for the city, we planned for a 25-year growth projection for 500,000 jobs and a quarter million housing units over a 25-year period. But those 25-year period of jobs came in 3 years. There's no way you can build the capacity and the infrastructure to absorb that kind of growth, but it came. And with that came an explosion in real estate prices, an explosion in rentals. You may have heard the analogy of a one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco in 2018 was over 4,000 US dollars a month. That's way too high. And now things have changed, but it's still very expensive. This is for those who have not been to San Francisco, this is the central business district overlooking the waterfront. That tall tower in the foreground is the Salesforce Tower, which is the tallest building in the Bay Area. Those who are architects will realize that this looks just like the building in Hong Kong because it's by the same architect. And you know how architects like to replicate their icons, but here it is. But things have changed dramatically since the pandemic. We have now seen a dramatic drop in rent in real estate leases. We've had an increase in vacancies. We were at 5% before the pandemic. We're at 16.7% right now. That's a dramatic shift for a central business district. We have almost 15 million square feet of vacancy, which is about 1.5 million square meters of vacancy. That's a lot. And that tower that I mentioned before, what that looks like is about 11 of these office towers of vacancy. And that just happened in the last 12 to 14 months. Something like that is quite a shock to the system. And we really can't bounce back as quickly as we'd like to, because this is a real change. This didn't happen because of the pandemic only. It happened because of the pandemic and the technology like Zoom, which we're on right now, which is also in San Francisco, and the ability to work remotely from home, which is the majority of these office workers. All these three things basically converged, and now we're seeing the after effects in a city that was heavily invested in high technology, heavily invested in startups, and already had a culture where you could work from home anyway. And so this was a real big impact for our central business district. And it's also changed people's rental situations. Rents in San Francisco have dropped the furthest because they're from a very, very high place to begin with. But even with the massive rental drop of 25, 30% in some situations, a one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco is still too expensive for the majority of the Bay Area residents. So it's still over $2,600 a month. And while that dropped 25%, $2,600 a month is still a lot of money to pay. And so at the same time, what that's doing is it's opening up a whole new cohort of people who were completely priced out of the dream of living in San Francisco, who now can enter and live here. And it's also allowing certain people who really wanted to leave the Bay Area in San Francisco now the choice to leave because of the work from home, remote work opportunity. And so we've heard a lot of stories of like mass exoduses and people are leaving and millions of people are leaving. But the data tells the opposite story. Of all the people that have been claiming to leave the Bay Area and California, we're seeing numbers that are very different. The media would let you think that there's millions of people leaving California. First of all, we have 40 million people in California. We have 9 million people in the metropolitan area of the Bay Area. We have 21 million people in the Los Angeles area. We're talking about a couple of thousand people that have moved around, that have left the state. There have been people who have left the Bay Area, but they've actually moved within the Bay Area. So those who want to move for space reasons, for whatever reasons they had, are moving and they're going to move anyway. So this is not because of this situation. But let's be clear about the numbers we're talking about. We're talking about thousands of people that have left or that will leave as well, versus the millions that are staying and remaining. So there's a really big difference in that. Also, when we look at the Bay Area itself, most people who have moved from places like San Francisco or Oakland or San Jose have actually moved somewhere else in the Bay Area. Very few have left to leave the state, let alone leave the region. So don't believe in the hype of all those stories. People are staying, they're staying in place. They're just wanting to get back to a world where they can meet in person and do more things in person. But it is having a dramatic impact in these, what I call downtowns or business districts that were glorified office parks. These were basically high-rise, high-density office parks that had no connection to the ground. They really weren't a neighborhood. They really weren't a 24-hour location service area. And if we're going to see any changes, we have to bring more people to live in those places, convert the space, all the things that Joanna just mentioned just before. We need to see those things happen before those fine-grained details can actually make sense. But from a transport perspective, we're seeing changes happen a lot faster because the real estate side had moved so much faster and transport was just catching up. We're going to see more transport changes now, more changes on our streets, physical street changes, more design changes, just more directional flow changes. If we don't have to have so many people working in the central business district every day, all the time, we're going to allow our street spaces to be redesigned, to be reconfigured, to be much more neighborhood scale rather than these, 5-lane one-way traffic sewers. They can become more of these, streets where we can linger and walk around and enjoy it and actually hang out outside. And wouldn't it be amazing if we could convert some of these spaces so that all ages, all groups, all types feel safe, comfortable, and invited to hang around? Children, so many of these downtowns were so corporate that they were just so family unfriendly and just the other unfriendly. If we can make it more inclusive and more exciting, then the street space might be the first place we can see those changes. Just to give you an example, we did a car-free Market Street, our busiest street in San Francisco. We made it car-free. That was the photo in January of 2020. This was the photo in February 2020. 1 month later, after the change happened, a massive shift. People got on their bicycles. The public transit system ran more effectively. Everybody was walking more. Everyone just felt safer. Everyone just felt more inclusive. It felt more of a city. And then when COVID struck, it just became completely quiet. I rode my bike down a couple of times. I was the only person in the street sometimes for 2 or 3 blocks. It was really eerie feeling. But the template was there. You can see the protected bike lanes in green, the protected transit lanes in red, the wider sidewalks that went in a few years ago, all the amenities were there. And I think if we can focus on that, all of the changes in the buildings will change, whether it's occupancy of residents, occupancy of workers, et cetera. Those things will figure themselves out. The ground floors will figure themselves out with all the push from the city, et cetera. But the street space between the buildings, that space really is the time now to change the template and design it for people, design it for inclusive gatherings, and to design it for spaces that people want to hang around in. So we're in this really interesting moment right now worldwide. We're working with a bunch of companies and governments around the world on, we have to press that trigger moment. Like, this is the point now, okay, we're resetting, as was mentioned before, we're going to start. What does that mean? It means that we're going to triage what we can handle and control and manage, and we may have to let go of the things that are out of our control. That's just the reality we have. There'll be opportunities to pivot and shift away from the things that are holding us back, and rethink, what does this look like from our street space, from our buildings, et cetera, and then start charting a course for recovery that is much more inclusive. You know, everyone talks about going back to normal. We don't want to go back to normal. Normal was horrible. It was exclusive. It was discriminatory. It blocked people out from access opportunity. We want to bring it back to a place that's much more inclusive. And that allows us to transform, to be more resilient, to be more adaptive. You know, of all the pressures and sadness and tragedy that COVID brought to us, it is a drop in the ocean compared to what's happening and coming towards us with climate change. So we need to figure this out very quickly, and we need to do it together and transform together. And so we've seen this happen all over the world, whether they're reallocating space on the streets, whether they're testing new opportunities for public transport, whether they're looking at curbside delivery and pickup and drop-off zones. All of this is ways that we can reimagine and redesign our spaces so that they're more inclusive, while the buildings figure out their associations with occupancy. And we have to do it inclusively. We can't have a two-tiered society that we've experienced in the US. This is a really important photo for you to look at. This is a reclaimed street that was taken away from car traffic, create a parklet, a temporary parklet, so people could outdoor dining. But those people that are protesting for Black Lives Matter, for racial discrimination, and for the racism that's affecting our society. We can't have these dual societies that one just ignores the other one. We have to work together. And while you are experiencing the outdoor dining experience, you really need to also focus on the fact that, what are we using our streets for? And what are the larger systems issues that we're focusing on that mean things like policing our public spaces, policing certain bodies over others? And while we want people to walk and bicycle, if you don't feel safe because you'll be arrested or harassed by police, that is not the answer to our situations. We need to look at ways how we can make this much more of a community-led process, so that whatever this looks like, it is community-driven, community managed, and community owned, so that we can ensure that this looks like something that is much more inclusive and not this photo, which is really exclusive. So just going to close on some of the actions that have been taken by cities like my city in San Francisco, where they're looking at all this and saying, okay, based on these situations, slow streets or green streets or whatever the streets you want to call them that are not car dominated look like this in certain neighborhoods. In other neighborhoods, for example, in the Tenderloin, which has a high homelessness population, a high population of mental health issues, et cetera, they're looking at it differently. It may be that we look at closing certain streets, limiting access to certain streets, changing the way streets are policed or enforced. All of these things basically are being looked at. And I think a more community-driven approach will help us move forward in these downtowns in the future. So I want to close by saying these downtowns are more than just bricks and mortar. They're more than just buildings, streets. They're people. If we can make them more inclusive, more community-oriented, more community-driven, where all groups and all people can merge together and coexist and actually thrive, then we'll be able to adapt to all of the situations that are coming towards us, including climate change. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate being here.
Thank you, Tim. That was great.